Okay, so welcome back to those of you who are joining us on the computer screen. And I'm very happy to introduce again Professor Gerhard Weinberg for the second session, which is entitled Fighting and Conquest in 1941 and 42. So back to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. As the Germans invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941, it's important to keep in mind that there was an important difference in the strategic concepts of Hitler and Stalin. Stalin was certain that the Germans were most interested in both the agricultural and industrial areas of the Ukraine, and would therefore emphasize in any offensive, if and when they invaded the Soviet Union, the southern part of what would be the Eastern Front, and allocated troops accordingly. Hitler was clear in his own mind that the best thing to do was to concentrate in the middle of the front and get Moscow. The realities were that Stalin would not believe any of either Soviet intelligence or British or American warnings that the Germans were about to attack. He just wouldn't believe it and would not prepare in detail. Hitler sent 3 army groups, one in the north, the biggest one in the middle, and another one in the south to the east. And the reality was that, of course, Soviet troops were completely surprised. What on earth is going on? And much of the Soviet Air Force was destroyed on the ground by the German Air Force, which had been flying over the Soviet Union with Stalin ordering the anti-aircraft guns and fighters never to try to bring the Germans down. So they knew where the Red Air Force was, and a high proportion of it is destroyed quite literally on the first day. The German armies advanced rapidly. And there are 2 aspects of the Soviet reaction, which, in my opinion at least, are very important because they affect subsequent developments. One of them is that as they pull out and retreat, in the jails, they kill all the inmates. In industry, they haul much of the machinery, equipment, and specialized workers back as far as possible. In many cases, the other side of the Ural Mountains. And that, of course, would play an important part later in the Soviet recovery. More or less simultaneously with the Soviets killing those they had jailed, the Germans start killing Jews. This is where what we today call the Holocaust begins. Systematic killing of Jews. As they advance, the Germans kill more. And as perhaps you know, there is this famous or infamous situation in the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, where from it and nearby towns, tens of thousands are taken to nearby Babi Yar and killed. By the end of the German occupation, somewhere over 1 million have been killed. As the Germans move into Ukraine, Ukrainian nationalists welcome them at first and raise what were to be cooperating forces. The Ukrainian nationalists are divided into those following Bandera and those following Melnik. I'm not going to go into this very complicated business, except what is important, I would suggest, for the developments in the Ukraine under German occupation is that the two Ukrainian nationalist movements are rivals of each other, and at times work with the Germans and at times don't, at times are helped by the Germans, and at times are crushed by Germans. It's an unbelievably complicated business, but what I would suggest to you is important is for an understanding of what goes on is that there are these rival Ukrainian nationalist movements, both wanting an independent Ukraine, and at first, because of the positive memories that I mentioned earlier, that Ukrainians have of their World War I experience of the Germans and Austro-Hungarians. There isn't any great public resistance of the invading armies in the Ukraine. The Germans do not advance as rapidly in the south as in the middle and in the north, because, as I mentioned earlier, Stalin had thought that the main German thrust would be in the south, and therefore he had more troops and equipment there. So in the 1941 fighting, the Germans first moved much further in the middle and in the north. And then, because they're being slowed down in the south, Hitler orders armored units from the center to head south. And because Stalin will not allow the Red armies in the south to withdraw, there is an enormous number, somewhere around 600,000 Red Army soldiers surrounded by the Germans, who then advance, and the soldiers, for the most part, surrender. What happens relatively quickly, I'm talking now about the Southern Front in 1941, is that a very large part of it is occupied by the Germans and the Romanian troops that are fighting there alongside the German forces. But they do not yet conquer the Crimea, and I will come back to that. as the Germans occupy, they establish in a majority of the area a civil administration headed by Erich Koch, who had been the Nazi Party commander in East Prussia. He, however, spends most of his time back in what was then Königsberg and is now Kaliningrad, his capital in East Prussia. But he does administer a large part of the Ukraine, and various and sundry Nazi Party officials are assigned to this. Koch himself is tried after the war and kept in a prison in Poland until he dies in 1986. But I want to comment somewhat on the initiations of occupation policy in the Ukraine. What the Ukrainians want, as you will easily understand, is to do away with the collective farms. There is a supposed change imposed by the Germans, but in practice and reality, something given a new name, but in reality, very much like the collective farms, remains in effect in the German-occupied area. In that area, furthermore, on the one hand, religion by the Christians is stimulated by a reopening of many of the churches that had been closed earlier. On the other side, the education system is limited to the fourth grade. That is to say, students can go first, second, third, and fourth grade, but there is no more education above that. All higher education is closed down. What you also had was, at least on a small scale to begin with, and a larger one later in the war, is some recruitment of some Ukrainian nationalists into German military formations. Hitler is, to begin with, absolutely opposed to such things, but by 1942 has begun to change on this. Now, one of the most dramatic events, rarely discussed, is that the Germans do two things that are seen in the public. Number one, as opposed to the, for the most part, reasonable treatment of prisoners of war in the First World War, the Germans are deliberately slaughtering Red Army prisoners of war by the thousands, hundreds of thousands. And please note, this is important in my opinion. This is not secret anywhere. This is being done all over the Ukraine, wherever these men were captured. And when locals try to bring food to the collected Red Army prisoners, they are stopped by the Germans. They want the POWs to die of hunger. And you will understand that this complete difference from the World War I experience very quickly gets around. As far as the Germans are concerned, they don't give a hoot. But my point here is the population that remembers or has been told by daddy or mama or grandparents what happened in the First World War. It's not that far back, you see. This is an entirely different army doing an entirely different things from what they did the last time they were here 20 years ago. There is another issue that I think is closely related to this, both in what happens and its impact. From the German point of view, in the main part of the Ukraine, all they're interested in is the farms and the food that's produced. In the cities, and in particular in the biggest and important one, Kiev, the capital, those are people we don't want. And the Germans engineer quite deliberately a famine in Kiev. Several 100,000 civilians. I'm not talking about Bobby Yar, the murder of Jews. I'm talking about the deliberate starvation of inhabitants of a city. And when people from nearby communities try to bring food to starving friends and relatives who live in Kiev, in the capital, the Germans stop it. That is to say, this is a deliberate, intentional killing by hunger of a very large part of the urban population. And as I said, it is Kiev where this is done on the most systematic way, because there are German patrols in the outskirts of the city to stop people from bringing food in, or those who are starving, going out and maybe living with friends or relatives or somebody who will give them a little something to eat. And it should not be difficult to understand that word of this gets around very quickly, that this is nothing of this sort had happened in the First World War. I'm not suggesting that in the First World War, people afterwards thought back of that as the good old days. They knew they weren't the good old days. But there had been absolutely nothing of this sort of deliberately starving people in the city to death by taking the food out and physically preventing people from bringing any in. There's no secrecy about this, obviously. And when eventually Ukraine gets back under Soviet control, talk about that later, approximately 4 million Ukrainians have been killed or have died during the period of German rule. It's simply a part of the German occupation. Now, In the area to the north of the Ukraine, Belarus, White Russia, there is a very, very substantial partisan movement. In the Ukraine, there is a partisan movement, but it's nothing like what's further north. And a major reason for this difference is not that the people in the Ukraine are happier than the people in Belarus. It's that the terrain is fundamentally different. Most of the Ukraine, the central and southern part of the Ukraine, is open country, whereas much of Belarus is forest country. That means partisans can hide and then strike out here or strike out there, and it's much more difficult terrain for the German occupation forces to control. Most of the Ukraine is relatively open country, it's farm country, most of it. And so you just simply don't have in the central and southern Ukraine much of resistance or partisan movement. It's just simply the reality of the terrain makes this kind of resistance exceedingly difficult. But the other side is that further north in Belarus, the terrain, to some extent at least, makes things a little easier for the partisan movement. One just has to look at the realities. The Romanians are, as I said, much involved in the fighting. And the nationalists, sometimes the OUN, Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, although it's divided, as I mentioned, between the Melnik and the Bandera followers, occasionally cooperates with the Germans and occasionally fights them. In particular, some of them cooperate with the Germans in the Holocaust, in the slaughter of Jews in communities, and especially the smaller cities. In one place to the west of Kiev, in a place called Hegewald, Hegewald, the Germans initiate a kind of program that eventually was to be characteristic of the whole Ukraine. There is a tiny proportion of people of German background living there. And what the Germans do is move Germans from elsewhere in occupied Europe into Hegewald. And there they simply kick Ukrainians out of their homes, literally, and the next day move in some Germans. You have, in other words, a kind of local experimentation in one part. It's about 150 miles west of Kiev, which becomes, if you will, a German community in the completely surrounded, obviously, by areas inhabited by Ukrainians. But it is an interesting experimentation on which there is some good literature, especially Professor Lowry has written on this, and which is of historic interest because it's a part of the direction in which the Germans were planning to go in the long run. This was the future for the Ukraine was German settlement. And the Ukrainians would be either kicked out, killed, or sterilized, but they wouldn't be any in the Ukraine. And it's interesting and very sad for those involved because you will understand that, as I will point out, when the Red Army comes back to these areas, all the German settlers try to flee. But the reason I mention this, and I think it's important, is that it is a kind of indicative clue of what in the long run the Germans had in mind. This was not the kind of departure into something special, but it was just simply, for us today, a clue to long-term German policy as to what was to happen here. Now, what is, in my opinion, significant is that the German administration, which is a civil administration for about 2/3 of the conquered area, and there's military administration in the other third, right behind the front, is of two types simultaneously. Simultaneously, Jews are being slaughtered. Gypsies, Roma are being slaughtered. Russian prisoners of war from the Red Army are being slaughtered and starved to death. But at the same time, some of the German administrators are not doing quite so much of this. They are not opposed to the basic policy, but they want to run their area quietly if possible, and therefore behave more as, if you will, normal administrators instead of exploiting slaughterers. And that also means that there is some difference in the way that the German troops operate. They participate to a very considerable extent in the slaughtering, obviously of prisoners of war, but also of Jews, Gypsies, and some categories of Ukrainians. On the other side, German soldiers are trading food with Russian, Ukrainian women. And by the time it's all over, there are about 10,000 children, babies born to Ukrainian women who have sold sex for food. It's a situation with all kinds of differences, and one has to realize that this is a huge area in which all kinds of things are happening. And the arguments as to what to do locally. Please note, locally, simply continue in the German administrative apparatus from the beginning of the occupation until the end. And as I mentioned, Hitler at one point gives way to the military recruiting Ukrainians. And there is eventually a Ukrainian unit in the German military force. This is the other side, if you will, of the deliberate starvation of people in Kiev and the deliberate starvation of those prisoners of war that the Germans take and haven't yet shot. The population becomes much more opposed to the Germans as the Germans move to recruit workers. During the course of the period that we're talking about, fall of 41 to 44, approximately 1.5 million Ukrainians are forcefully deported to work in Germany in the factories. They are collected all over the occupied area. Local administrators are given quotas to recruit. And I think it is fair to say that of all the measures that the Germans take in the occupied Ukraine, this is the one that causes or contributes to the most opposition to the occupation regime. The forced recruitment of labor, the kidnapping is perhaps the best term to use here, of literally hundreds of thousands of men and women, and their deportation to Germany to work there in factories and on farms. Obviously, these people are themselves unhappy about it, but you will understand that their families and neighbors are worried. And although it is true that in the end, because Germany is defeated, a very high proportion of these forced workers survive, and many of them return. The whole process, I'm talking now when the people are taken, is very much opposed and leads to a general sense that this is awful and the Germans are terrible. And when you combine this with the deliberate famine in the Ukraine and in Kiev, and the slaughter of Russian prisoners of war, that as I said, is a completely new experience. And to at least a goodly number of people in the Ukraine, this is deliberately worse than what Stalin had done to them in the 1930s. You will want to remember that the people in the Ukraine, for very good reasons, all remember the horrors of collectivization and the famine that followed and the purges and so on. But now, what the Germans impose, that at first looked likely to people to be nothing like what they had experienced, and more like what they'd heard about it happened in the First World War, they now discover, most of them, that this is even worse than what Stalin had done to them. And that these outsiders who have conquered, whether they're Romanians or Hungarians or Germans, this is even worse. They had thought, and you will understand if you think about it a little bit, that nothing could be worse than what they had experienced in the 1930s under Stalin. But now they have discovered, they are in the process of discovering, if you will, that the Germans are even worse. That in terms of the daily life and death of the people, ordinary people, this is more horrendous than what the Soviet regime had done to them, and that they had greatly resented in the late 20s, but particularly in the 1930s. There are some who go along with the German regime, but the number shrinks rather than growing. And it shrinks because the German policies as applied are so horrendous. And I think that when you hear about or read about individual Ukrainians helping and saving individual Jews, as the Germans apply the Holocaust in Ukraine, I think you have to see this in a context where this is one of these awful things the Germans are doing. And whatever the individuals think about Jews or don't, this is simply another German policy, and some Ukrainians simply won't go along. This is a form of resistance that is growing out of the horrors that are not hidden away someplace, and that the regime, the administrative regime, is in no ways trying ever to hide. I think that's the part which I think is very important. There is no effort by the Germans ever to hide what they are doing from the masses of people. It is all out in public view. And from the perspective of the German leadership, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Because if then any see this and object to it, they can be easily identified and killed. There is no, from the point of view of the German leadership, there is no interest in hiding starvation policies, murder policies, or other such policies. And the recruitment, as I've mentioned already, of Ukrainians for forced labor in Germany is done in public. There's no effort whatsoever to conceal anything that is done. And you will understand that it is in these circumstances that substantial numbers of people in the Ukraine see something or think of something that they had never thought conceivable, that anything could be worse than rule from Moscow had seemed absolutely inconceivable to most people in the Ukraine. But now, in front of those who survived, in the competition for evil, the Germans run away with the trophies, absolutely. And so the public reaction scattered across the whole area, I think we have to recognize, sees this as something that they had never believed would be possible. This is worse than what we endured under Stalin. And in that regard, yes, a couple million died in the famine, but 4 billion die under German rule. It's, however, simply the way in which the Germans do this, and it is not coincidental or accidental. That is what I think is very important. In wartime, all kinds of things occasionally go wrong, and some things go bad. But that generally isn't what the leadership intended. What is obvious, because this continues, keep in mind large parts of the Ukraine are occupied in the fall of 41 and remain occupied for several years. These are not unfortunate accidents of war. These are clearly, to anybody who sees it, a part of a policy. And that under those circumstances, cooperation with the Germans, of which there is some, is almost certain in the eyes of the mass of the population, something horrendous. What you try to do is live through it somehow. And of course, the majority of them do. they don't know that in the long run, they're all going to be displaced by or replaced by German settlers. That the Germans have, except in the Hegewald, one area kept from the public knowledge, but that their rule is worse than what they experienced in the way of horrors in the 1930s. This tops that, and one just has to do what one can under the circumstances. It's not nice, but you will want to remember that the German plans and intentions were not nice in the least, but just quite intentionally and knowingly the opposite. Now it's your turn.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to bring this over so I can monitor questions also coming in from the live stream. Okay, let me open it to comments, questions. Yeah, Ann.
So I'm curious about the timing. Did the Germans decide that Western Europe was pretty much under their control and the US wasn't going to come in? So, hey, now's the time to take over Russia?
I'm sorry, what is the question?
The timing. Did they decide that by the summer of 41 that Western Europe was under German control and therefore, and the US wasn't going to come in anytime soon, so Germany could then move into Russia? Why did they pick that time to start moving into Russia?
So the question is, did they decide by the spring of 41 that Western Europe was under control? And therefore, and they also assumed the United States was not coming in. So this was the moment to move into the Soviet Union. It was
Yes.
all about the timing.
Oh, the time. Well, Hitler, as I mentioned, postponed it several times, but at the end of July 1940, he tells his top military, who know that this is coming, that we'll do it next spring. And Hitler had wanted to do it earlier, but had to postpone it several times. So the June 41 is in fact more than a year later than when he originally hoped to do it. And the top military leaders are aware of that. That's the plan. And there is an aspect to this which is interesting but not often mentioned. In 1939, when the Germans are making their deal with with Stalin, and the German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop flies to Moscow, he is authorized by Hitler to give Stalin more than Stalin has the nerve to ask for, because we're going to take it all back anyway. So if they want a little more, let them have it now. I mean, we want them on our side while we take care of those wretched Brits and French, and then we'll take it all. And that's one of those things. As I said, we know that. And Hitler had hoped the Polish campaign could be followed by the one against Britain and France still in 39 in the winter, finish them, and then do the Soviet Union in May or June of 1940. And as soon as the war in the West goes well in May of 1940, he and German Army Chief of Staff Halder are planning to invade the Soviet Union in September of 1940. And then there are reasons, I don't want to take time for the details, that the fall of 1940 won't work. So at the end of July 1940, Hitler tells the top military commanders we're invading the Soviet Union in May of next year. And then he has to postpone it again for another month. So this is something that's long been in the plans, but for a variety of reasons gets put into the date that we all know it actually takes place.
What about the significance that Britain didn't surrender and the Battle of Britain continued and the air campaign had Hitler assumed Britain would be out of the war, and the fact that Britain didn't go out of the war had an effect on this delay?
No, the delays are first that the war in the West cannot be launched in the fall of 1939. They're just certainly not ready. And then that moving all the troops from the West to the East and getting the additional equipment and maybe crushing Britain leads to the postponement from 1940 September to May of 41. By that time, however, it is clear that Britain is not yet surrendering, but the assumption is that once the Soviet Union is crushed, and that's going to only take 6 or 8 weeks, then the Brits have to face the whole German military. The Germans no longer have to keep any force to worry about Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, or Southern Europe. This is the other side of what impolite people could say to Stalin when he kept urging the Americans and the Brits to invade Western Europe. You're alone on the continent as a result of your own stupidity. First, you helped the Germans crush Eastern Europe, Poland. Then you helped them conquer Northern Europe. Then you helped them crush Western Europe. Then you helped them crush Southern Europe. Big surprise, you're alone with them now in Eastern Europe. That's not the nastiness of Churchill and Roosevelt. It is the result of the stupidity of Stalin.
So I have a question here that's come in online.
Yes.
From Iris Hill. Iris asks, among the Red Army prisoners who were slaughtered by the Germans, were there a number of Ukrainians? In other words, were there a lot of Ukrainians in the Red Army? And she actually says she met a man who had been in the Red Army at that time. Were there a lot of Ukrainians in the Red Army?
Yes, there were lots of Ukrainians. You have to keep in mind that at the time, I'd say somewhere between a quarter and a third of the population of the Soviet Union were Ukrainians. And there were lots of Ukrainians who had been drafted like other people into the Red Army. And when the Germans were slaughtering Red Army soldiers, it made no difference to them what their background was, whether they were Great Russians, whether they were Ukrainians, whether they were Kazakhs, whether they were Uzbeks. That from the German point of view, the key thing was they're Red Army soldiers.
Yeah, and she goes on to say that this person she met had become pro-Russian But I assume it's because of that experience of the war, you know, so there were many Ukrainians who came out of the war with a strong pro-Soviet attitude at that
Yes.
time. Yeah.
They were not quite as awful as the Germans.
Yeah. Okay, so let me move away from the computer. I'll come back and come over here. Yeah, Brent.
Gerhard, I'm gonna make a comment and then I'll have my question. You brought up that prior to the war, the Germans experimented on the Germans for the Holocaust to come. So they were killing innocent Germans, and they did the Holocaust, killed a lot of people there. Then they starved people in the Russian cities who were civilians, and then they killed prisoners of war in the Red Army. So they sort of had four big killings. The question is, where did all that meanness and mania to kill people, how did that come up through? Was it just Hitler's leadership, or where did all the meanness come from?
Well, the leadership had been promising this. And the public, not all of them, but for the vast majority, were in favor. If you'd gone around the world in 1930, there would have been no country other than Germany where a population majority would vote, the largest number would vote for a political party that wants another war. People elsewhere, and a minority in Germany too, thought that World War I was quite enough for the century. And we tend to forget, you see, that on these kinds of issues, it wasn't that Hitler never told a lie, but he did not pretend about coming to war and persecuting and most likely killing Jews. Those were in the public domain. And not all Germans, but enormous numbers voted for this. And he delivered on it. Those were his promises. And they got all the wars they could conceivably have wanted. It didn't come out the way they had hoped. But one has to recognize that there was, to the best of my knowledge, no other country on earth where a political party calling for another war could have gotten the largest number of votes of any political party a decade and a half after the end of World War I. It was in most countries exactly the opposite. People were determined, gracious. We don't want anything like this ever to happen again. But they got it.
So would it be accurate to say, here I'm going to jump in as an interested historian, the legacy of nationalism, which convinced people that Germany had been mistreated in the war. But then there was the other issue, and let's call it the big lie. If Germany was the great country, they didn't lose the war. They had been betrayed, right? That I don't know, socialists or Jews or evil conspirators had taken from Germany what it had actually won. And this big lie was accepted by so many people. It wasn't an inherent meanness of the German people. It was just they bought the lie. Would that be correct?
I think that that is correct. I mean, that's a very large part of it. There is an interesting sidelight to this particular argument that you just repeated for them. In Germany, in World War I, there were those who hated Jews, who made lots of publicity that the Jews weren't serving their part in the German military in the First World War. Whereupon, in 1916-17, there was what was officially called, translated into English, as a Jew count. And when they proceeded to do a count, they kept the results secret. It was highly classified because it showed, as somebody who knew something about German society would have predicted, that Jews were serving in the German army deliberately, disproportionately heavily. The reason being that anybody could have predicted that very important areas of employment were closed to Jews. So they got drafted, and curiously enough, Allied shells, bullets, and bombs did not discriminate on the basis of religion. So the proportion of Jews killed and wounded in the First World War was higher than the proportion of non-Jews. So the results of this census that was taken was highly classified and did not come out until after the Second World War to show what, as I said, somebody who knew something about German society would have predicted. We tend to forget, for example, that people would get deferred from the draft if they were important in certain munitions factories and so on. But the labor unions in Europe were the descendants of the guilds. And to be a member of the guild, you had to be from a Christian family. So that the number of Jews deferred from being drafted because their employment was essential, was smaller than the other. So, but people, if people have strong beliefs, neither statistics nor chronology is allowed to interfere. You see this today in the chronological area. The first Arabs to move from Arabia into Palestine did so in the 7th century, the 630s. When they got there, Jews had been there for a little over 2,000 years. But if you listen to the radio or watch TV, you always get the notion that the Arabs are the original inhabitants of Palestine. They first came there a couple thousand years after the Jews, but the chronology is not allowed to interfere with the prejudice. And so in the Germany of the 1930s, the statistical reality which had been kept secret was not allowed to interfere with the belief that there had been a stab in the back.
So, okay, I was gonna ask another question, but I see Abby has one, so I'm gonna go over here.
You spoke about 10,000 children being born to Ukrainian women and German soldiers. Did Germany have a policy about those children? Were they Germans? Or did they even have time to come up with a policy?
Keep in mind that by late 44, the Germans are out of the Ukraine. So that a very high proportion of these births either occurred in the last year or months of German occupation, and in many cases after the Germans have left. I have never seen any evidence as to any particular German policies about this issue. It's just one of those things that the post-war Ukraine and Soviet government have to deal with.
Okay,
Yeah, you said that the Germans murdered 3.5 million Russian POWs. That's such a high number. As far as I know, they didn't have any death camps for POWs like they had for the Jews. So how were they able to kill that many people as prisoners
They
of
were
war?
able to kill that many POWs because they had the incidents and the time. Keep in mind that a very large proportion of these were captured in 1941. And there are hundreds of thousands being killed already in 41, and very large numbers in 42. My own guess is that the majority of them are killed in 41 and 42. And what you had is a situation where quite literally huge numbers in the Ukraine in the fall of 1941, the Germans capture over 300,000 Russian soldiers, and they don't feed them. So by the end of 41, of those 300,000, probably more than half are already dead. It's one of these things. You're quite right. They are not taken to any of the extermination facilities or anything of that sort. Now, but the other side of this is that the Ukrainian and Russian population know that this is not the statistics, but they know that the Germans are killing captured Red Army men in enormous numbers, because there is no effort on the part of the Germans to keep this secret. And as I mentioned in my talk, Ukrainians who try to bring food to assembled prisoners of war are deliberately prevented from doing so by the Germans. The mass slaughter and starving to death of the POWs is not statistically, but as a fact, known to the population.
Where did they put all the bodies?
Where did they put all the bodies?
They buried and burned. They buried and burned. I think that's the only way to explain this. And furthermore, in many areas, they simply left them dead lying on the ground. In one of the books on this subject that's in your list of readings, there is a picture of a woman walking in a field which is completely strewn with dead Red Army men looking for someone. Then what really happened is that in many cases, especially in 41 and 42, it is local people who find some way to bury bodies. But there is no systematic German disposition of bodies as there was in the extermination centers. That was, as I mentioned in my talk, in my first talk, a part of their planning in the euthanasia program. That was an issue that comes up. What do you do with thousands of corpses when you're systematic killing people? And the Germans established burning facilities at the centers where they killed people. But the Soviet prisoners of war are not killed in such institutions. They are killed in the fields all over the place. And much of the time, as I said, the bodies are simply left lying there.
Gerhard, I wanted to ask you a question, this question of systematic displacement of people to occupy the land. A lot of historians are now comparing what happened to the Native Americans in North Carolina and other places, to other genocidal interventions like this. For example, North Carolina was completely occupied by Native people who all disappeared, or they were systematically removed, or sometimes they were exposed to diseases, so they would die. And in fact, their land was then completely taken over, which is where we are right now. How would you compare the systematic displacement and death of Native Americans to the genocidal policies in Ukraine? What's similar or what's different?
Well, the similarity, if you will, is the long-term intent of displacement. But there are now more Native Americans in the United States than there were when the first white settlers came. And that's because the various native tribes were pushed to places and proceeded to raise families there. You had, if you will, a displacement program as opposed to a at least intentional.
There were
total
intentional murders, though. There were many,
disappearance.
yeah.
There were lots of Native Americans killed, but also in that fighting, some whites were killed too. But you did not have this kind of systematic extermination program, which was then to be implemented and was to be supplemented by a systematic sterilization program for those not killed.
Okay, well, this is one of the hot debates right now, is comparative genocidal studies. So I'm not going into that territory myself, but I've heard a lot of debates about it. That's interesting. Pardon? Oh,
Like you to go into that. I am a colonialist, born in Zambia, raised in Zimbabwe, British, and now all the stuff is coming in. And I was always brought up to believe that we were civilizing that part of the world. We were enabling people to have education and building roads and all the rest of it. And now I've got all this conversation. I don't know where I stand. I need help.
well, this is the whole debate about settler colonialism and its effects. So the German case is certainly extraordinary in some ways, but in other ways, it is not. And so anyway, I think we're out of time for this session. So we're going to take a lunch break, and let me say to the people on the Zoom, we'll be back in about 70 minutes. I think we start at 1:45. And if you're eating here, the food will be in the next room. Do you have a question? So we will reopen the Zoom room about 10 minutes before, so around 1:35. And for those of you in the room, can we thank Gerhard Weinberg for another outstanding presentation? Thank you, and we'll see you soon.